And on the good news front, we also just got a new shipment of ESV Bibles in as well. They're a little bit larger print. The ones in these are so tiny. It's almost like a eye test. But these have a little bit bigger type. This is a complaint oftentimes with the ESV, is that sometimes their print can be teeny tiny.
My problem is that they are all right together.
Sure.
I am able to read even this small print. I have no problem seeing it, but it's all run together. So,
right.
In the King James, they gave each verse its own paragraph or its own line, and
it makes it a lot easier to read. There's some very fascinating editions out there. One that's particularly interesting is a new edition that's coming out, which is what they call it, a sort of a reader's edition, where there are no verses, and it basically reads like a manuscript. It's very, very interesting. It's strange how it changes how one reads the scriptures when you take away the chapters and verses. For instance, the epistles read so much more in some ways like letters when you take out the verses and chapters. It's interesting how that affects things.
Yeah, that does sound interesting. Yes, because now, are you saying, I mean, I know you've probably said this before, I just can't remember.
No, please.
On the King James now, on the original documents, scrolls, whatever they were, did they have the verses, or did the people that did the King James number them in chapter?
The verses are a little bit older than the King James Version, but the originals would have no chapters, no verses.
So this new edition you're talking about would be more like the original.
Indeed, exactly right. The originals had no verses, no chapters. For instance, this letter by Paul would almost certainly been all capital letters, no punctuation, all slammed together, which makes your readers, that's quite a bit of decoding they had to do if you think about it, reading these letters out during the service. That's not easy. I mean, even now, you can imagine just slammed letters together and trying to read an English sentence with no punctuation, all capital letters all together. That's quite difficult. But you had to save space. I mean, the paper was very, either the papyrus or the vellum, the animal skins they were using was so expensive. It was the way you had to do it.
Well, I personally think that the numbers distract from the meaning sometimes.
They can sometimes. They can be a bit arbitrary.
Right.
Yeah.
Especially in the way you've interpreted some of this or explained some of it, you just about have to read 2 or 3 verses together.
Right.
Because when you read one verse, you're kind of out there.
You are. This is always the danger, of course, when people take a verse out of context.
Yes.
So they'll grab a verse and throw it someplace and say, look what this verse says.
Right.
You'll miss recognizing that that number is foreign to the original author who's writing. That you're absolutely right. That can very much change your meaning. It's why one is much better off studying the Bible in sections rather than just an individual verse and dragging them out of context. Most of the time, people get into trouble the vast majority of times people get into trouble with biblical interpretation. It's when they grab onto a verse and just squeeze it for all it's worth. I'm not recognizing that they're missing out on that context of what it means. Where is it coming in redemption history? Where is it coming in this individual letter? Now, the numbers are very helpful for us in terms of study. So much easier to say chapter 6, verse 15 or verse 12, rather than say somewhere in the middle. I mean, that is a huge benefit. But you're absolutely right that when they become sort of a totem. Yeah, they can become a little bit, absolutely. But let's take a look at, I think we can go ahead and get started. Waiting a little bit to see if we got any more visitors. But starting at verse 6, where we left off, again, we're talking about this idea of being dead to sin and alive with God, that the dying and rising with the Messiah. That in a sense, you always need to be thinking about how our baptism, in a real sense, is a change of our status, of who we are, who's our sovereign, who we in a sense even belong to. That changes definitively in baptism and sets us on the new exodus that we're on now. So verse 6. We know that our old self was crucified with him in order that the body of sin might be brought to nothing, so that we would no longer be enslaved to sin. So, the King James, for instance, puts that in as the old man, is how the King James will put that. But that old self, that's a very interesting idea. And the concept there is not a part of us, but our entire existence, our entire person is meant there, our entire self. And that self, that old self, was once in Adam. And what's fascinating here is that idea of being crucified with him. In the Greek, it really you could very much translate that as being sort of co-crucified. There's sort of the Greek there with the sin prefix, crucified together. And so Paul's point, remember, he's continuing on talking about baptism and our identity. Paul's point is that in baptism, the old identity of being in Adam is broken, decisively broken by an act is once and for all broken by death. Is there anything more serious in terms of breaking something than death? Death is what we're talking about here. And so that death breaks us from that old Adamic existence, being in Adam. Now, that doesn't mean, when we think about it, we think of sin and death, that sort of kingdom of sin and death. Now, that doesn't mean that Christians, cannot sin. That's not what Paul is talking about here. But we should still feel the sharp point of this doctrine before we start to sort of put caveats to it. This idea that our status as being sinners is gone. We've broken with that by being crucified with Christ. In baptism, the whole person leaves this Adam kingdom for good, never to return there. And it leaves it by death, which is a one-way journey. That's the strength of this. And this is a powerful statement about a powerful thing that's happening in baptism. And so then he says, why? What is why would this be? This so that. And the divine purpose of this is so that the body of sin might be destroyed, is brought to nothing, destroyed completely. So this is in a sense in which sin is sort of like its power is taken away and it's kind of allowed to kind of stay in the corner. We're really talking about that we would no longer be under the lordship of sin. Once again, this is very much our thinking about this. We're still in that Romans 5:21 universe, really Romans 5:20 through 21. If we look at 25:21 very quickly, so that as sin reigned in death, grace also might reign through righteousness, leading to eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. So you have sin and death reigning, and then grace reigning, these two kingdoms. And as 5:20 through 21, 5:12 through 21 show us, the superabundance of grace is so much greater than anything than sin and death could ever possibly be. That they're incomparable in their might and majesty. So again, Paul is emphasizing which of the two countries we live in. He talked about this idea that it's almost as we've emigrated from one country to another. So that an analogy being, you no longer live in France. Why are you still speaking French? It's kind of a funny way of thinking about it, but that's the idea of it. As I say, he's more concerned about status here than anything else. So as in 5:21, the sovereign rule of sin. Sin is allowed to rule the earth by Adam's failure, and that reign has now been broken by the new Adam, Jesus Christ, reversing that curse and becoming the king of creation. Sin has been broken by grace. There's not even a contest. And that grace, where does it most seriously operate? As we're saying, it operates in the obedient death and resurrection of Christ. When we look for where is that moment, there it is. When the righteousness of God is showcased in its greatest sense. It's there in the death and resurrection, the obedient, mind you, death and resurrection of Christ. The idea that Jesus is obedient even unto death. An obedience that that Adam so obviously failed to do. One beautiful way of thinking of this is to think of the tree of life that we lost in the garden, that Adam lost for us in the garden, is regained in the wood of the cross. That becomes the new tree of life. That's a vision of Revelation, that the tree of life is restored and it's the cross. Now that grace, we're still talking about baptism, that grace enfolds the baptismal candidate. And like we talked about, that idea of kind of intertwining, that sense of that intertwining, our story and Jesus' story become intertwined. We become inseparably linked in that way. That's what's happening in baptism. So instead of having our solidarity with the sinful people, there's this weird sense in which even there's honor among thieves, that phrase, where like thieves won't steal from each other because of like professional courtesy. There's a solidarity we have with sin or with other sinners. That solidarity is broken by baptism, and we now have solidarity with Jesus. That's very much a sense of what's happening here as well. And because of that, we're free to live under the lordship of Christ. So verse 7. For one who has died has been set free from sin. So here is a comment that for is a grounding clause. Whenever you see for, Paul uses that. It means it's explaining. It's grounded on what comes before. Is the idea. For one who has died has been set free from sin. This is a comment on those who have been co-crucified with Christ, like we talked about in verse 6. What's interesting here is if you look in the ESV, it has a note that the Greek here, I think it has it in that edition, it may not, but in most ESV editions, it has a note here that the actual Greek for that, rather than has been set free, the actual Greek, excuse me, it has been justified. Rather than has been set free, it has been justified. Now, what's interesting about that is once again we're confronted with this idea of justification. That's in verse 7. So we could really read verse 7 as for one who has been justified from sin. One who has died has been justified from sin. So the idea being that one who has died with Christ has been justified from or cleared from sin. Like the dying with Christ is what is justifying us. But why justified here? Why did Paul use justified rather than freed? It's an interesting question. And the answer is, the most likely answer is that he's continuing the law court metaphor. Continue that metaphor of us appearing before the judge and Christ and us being declared righteous because of the righteousness of God, that being our righteousness is the righteousness of Christ. He can continue that metaphor even as he's talking about baptism and our solidarity with Christ through that. He can keep those two ideas together. They don't have to be kind of ripped apart. So oftentimes when people comment on these verses, they sort of separate these two as far away from each other as they can. There's a sense in which the arguments are connected, and we'll see that further as we look in this chapter. That we'll even harken back to chapter 4, which was the chapter definitively about justification by faith. But we'll get there. So the key idea in that verse is that the Christian's freedom comes from God's judicial decision, and this judicial decision is embodied in baptism. So whenever we think of justification, there's a forensic side to it. There's that judgment side of it, and that judicial decision, declaring righteous, is embodied in baptism. And that we say that in the Creed every single week. One baptism for the remission of sins. There's a sense in which that act is an embodiment of that being declared righteous. So verse 8. Now, if we have died with Christ, we believe that we will also live with him. Classic Pauline style. He's going to give a big sort of pregnant statement like this and then unpack it in 9, 10, and 11. He's building toward his big conclusion, which is verse 11 of this idea. So the idea is if we co-died with the Messiah, if we co-died with him, then we will certainly co-live with him as well. If we've died with him, we'll live with him as well. And there's both a future aspect of this and a present aspect of it as well. Some of that is because, we'll get to that when we get to those verses. But there's a sense in which even now, as we talked about last week, that idea of being kind of on resurrection ground, that the resurrection of Christ is a sure thing and a sure sign of our future resurrection and our future glorification. That's a sure thing because through baptism we've died with the Messiah. That idea of being under the water and coming out of it, that imagery, being buried, as Paul says earlier in chapter 6, that imagery. And if we've died with Christ, we certainly will rise with him as well, or co-live with him is kind of the idea there. Verse 9. We know that Christ, being raised from the dead, will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over him. So here, if earlier we maybe didn't know if Paul's hearers knew what he was talking about, like he asked those rhetorical questions, is it not true? Those kind of ways in which he introduces his arguments. Here he says, we know. Like this is a given that this is what they know, that concept. You know that Christ being raised from the dead will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over him. So the Romans know this, even if just maybe in principle, and he's kind of unpacking. They know this idea. But the key idea here is that Jesus' resurrection, while it was a resuscitation, he was definitely dead and made alive. It's also more than that. We were just looking at the new window for the raising of Lazarus, and that's a resuscitation. Lazarus is raised, but he still will die again. The widow, a few weeks ago, we had the beautiful gospel story from Luke about the widow's son at Nain being raised, or Jairus' daughter being raised, right? So those are all resuscitations. But here, what happened at Easter was more than that. It was a resuscitation, but also a transformation of Jesus. the Jesus that goes into the Jesus that's hung on the cross is not the same Jesus that comes out of the tomb. Now, in terms of his person, in terms of everything that we would say makes a person who they are, yes, in terms of identity, but his body is transformed into the glorified body that we see. And so, what does that mean? That death no longer has any sovereignty over him, because he can never die ever again. That's what a glorified body, a big part of it is. That it's no longer on the shackles of this world, that death and decay no longer are broken out, that sin and death no longer has any kind of say over him whatsoever. But there's a sense, too, that this is happening even now on a grand scale. So let's see what he continues to say. For the death, verse 10, for the death he died to sin once for all, but the life he lives to God. So the idea here being, this is a beautifully balanced kind of rhetorical phrase. But the idea being that the Messiah came under the rule or the dominion of sin. He did it voluntarily. And what that means isn't that Jesus sinned, but that his death, through his death, he took the weight of sin on. He allowed sin to have dominion, because sin is death. He allowed it to have dominion over him. But in doing so, he was able to defeat it in its own domain. And all this, of course, happened, this beautiful idea of once for all. Something we always say in our prayer of consecration every Sunday. That idea of the book of Hebrews hammers this idea home, once for all. So what's great about this, there's no room for the idea that the Messiah and his people, because that's the connection here, have sort of one foot in the grave and one foot in the empty tomb. Christ is never, ever going to die again. He died once forever, and therefore thereafter is finished with death as a concept within himself. And what's great about that is what Paul's saying is that, and so have we. At the end of that verse, in that he lives to God. The idea being that Jesus now lives in God's domain, the domain of grace and righteousness. So there's that other kingdom. He is in that kingdom of grace and righteousness. So verse 11, this is the culmination of his argument. So you also must consider yourselves dead to sin and alive to God in Christ Jesus. It's the way this argument is, it's beautifully set out. So the key word here is this consider. And where do we know that from? It's our old friend, reckon, from chapter 4, verse 3, where we talked about Abraham believed and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. It's that same word again. So as I said before, we have that idea of justification by faith. It's here, that same reckoned. And as it's used elsewhere before, we've seen it pop up. So remember, that's a bookkeeping term. It's the idea of sort of, it's really in some ways kind of a math term. Kind of add it up. So he's telling us, so add it up, do the math on this. If the Messiah has died once for all and been raised, then you too have died once for all and will be raised. If we co-died with the Messiah, then we will be raised with him as well. That's the sort of like, he's like saying, just kind of do the math on this in a way. It's kind of a neat way to say that. And that reckoning takes place in the mind of, in the sort of the Christian thought process. Now, we have to be careful because the point isn't that the reckoning, like thinking about it or realizing this, actually affects the dying to sin and coming alive to God, any more than if we sort of, like if you were counting up things that those things you now created out of nothing. That's not the idea. The idea, though, is that it opens our hearts and minds to the reality that we are The idea has died once for all and been raised. The two have died once for all and will be raised. It opens our eyes to that reality. So one might almost say, in a sense, that Paul is kind of saying that he appeals for faith, like by thinking of your baptism, by meditating on your baptism, by realizing that what baptism is. That those who have received the sign of the new Exodus in the Messiah are urged to think through the implications of what that means. I think it's very, very easy, particularly for people who have been baptized as children, and who have to think of that as being an act that has no real relevance to their lives. And Paul is saying that that's not true. So he's saying in sort of that map that's drawn in 5:21 of the two kingdoms, the Christian belongs in the kingdom of grace and righteousness along with Christ. So we can see how this could kind of play out in someone questioning Paul. So if someone came to Paul and said that sin and death are just as powerful in their life as before they came to faith, Paul would say that they had not yet considered the seriousness of their baptism, of what had happened to them. Just as if someone claimed that after being baptized, evil no longer had any attraction whatsoever to them, he would say to them, you've not thought through the seriousness of sin yet. That there are two sides to that, definitely. But I find most of the time people do not think of their baptism as having anything to do with who they are or what they are or their status or anything. It's sort of something people go through, and particularly if it's done as a child, but even as people have done as adults. I sometimes find that people who are rebaptized over and over and over again are looking for some kind of like feeling or something to kind of hit them. Or they'll think, God help them, that it didn't count that last time because I didn't really mean it, whatever that means. But this time I really mean it, and this time I'll be different. But that doesn't make any sense with what Paul's saying here. It doesn't make any sense with what he's talking about here. This idea of baptism as being a change of our status, our change of our citizenship. It doesn't make sense why you would why the idea that you would be getting baptized in order to get a feeling. It seems to be grossly at odds with what he's talking about here. So we find that suffering, pain, depression, fear, all the things of this life are very much still the real enemies. But once again, the Christian already stands on resurrection ground, and a world in which resurrection has happened, a world in which that has already seen a transformation, a world that has already seen the beginning of the new creation in Jesus Christ. That is not a fantasy or hope, but a surety because it's already happened in Jesus Christ. It's a truth about Christ as sovereign Lord, and because of baptism, it's true of the Christian as well. That we're connected to that event, the death and resurrection of Christ, which is everything, which is the guarantee of a recreated space, of a recreated earth, of a new heaven and a new earth. So as when we talk, there's nothing blind about this faith at all. It's faith in a historical event. It's faith in something that happened in space and time. And that's actual real hope. Not based on feeling or a wish or a star. So any questions about that?
No.
That finishes 6:1 through 11. I love the way Paul argues this point in this whole section, just kind of almost like an erector set, building the argument from all angles. And people can sometimes get very uncomfortable with these, with this discussion of baptism. But I find it very, 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 very hopeful. And it's interesting how few times do you hear people say to someone who's having a crisis of faith to think about their baptism. That almost never happens. And it seems to be one of his primary things to say to a Christian is to think of your baptism. That is a really powerful event. It's strange how that almost never comes up when people are having a crisis of faith, or having doubt, or having a problem in their life. But the more you think about it, the more that embodiment of the judicial decision that makes us cleansed from sin is such a key part of who we are. That makes us, as Paul talked about last week, the resurrection people, the people who are defined by rising to glory. And we'll continue on next week as we talk about the implications of that, going through 6. And we should finish out, our goal in the next couple of weeks to finish out 6, and then we'll move into 7 and continue on smartly as we journey through the book. But it's hard to just run through that argument without breaking it down piece by piece, because otherwise it can get a bit confusing. And there's much more we can talk about. That idea of death no longer has dominion over him is such a powerful idea.
It's still a logical argument.
It is. It's perfectly logical. And there's nothing in this where it's ecstatic or it's emotionally based. It's a logical argument about things that have happened and the implications of those things thought out and reasoned. Yeah, there's nothing in here that you would go, this is just a crazy man writing nonsense. He's seen things that he is now trying to explain. He's to us the implications of those things.
But it does help to go back and read the first few verses.
It does. It's true. Absolutely. All right, if you no other questions, we'll end for the night. But